The Untold Files.
Everybody wants to know what happened to Frank Matthews. On July 2nd, 1973, Frank Matthews, 29 years old, facing 50 years in federal prison, ranked by the DEA as one of the top 10 drug traffickers in American history, skipped his court date in Brooklyn, emptied his safety deposit boxes, picked up his girlfriend Cheryl Denise Brown, and vanished, with somewhere between $15 and $20 million in cash. Gone. No fingerprints, no confirmed sightings, no body, no arrest. The greatest disappearing act in the history of American organized crime. And who did he leave behind? Barbara Hinton, his common-law wife, the mother of his 3 sons, the woman who had been beside him through the entire ride, the Staten Island mansion across from Gambino boss Paul Castellano, the luxury cars, the prime seats at every sporting event, the Las Vegas trips with suitcases packed full of cash. She watched all of it. She knew all of it. She was in all of it. And then, when the federal government descended on her with everything they had, grand jury subpoenas, immunity offers, conspiracy charges, threats that could destroy her life, Barbara Hinton said 5 words that became legendary in law enforcement circles. She had never heard of a man named Frank Matthews. For 53 years, she never changed that answer, never cooperated, never gave a single word, never remarried, never publicly mourned him as dead, raised those 3 boys alone, absorbed the pressure, took the indictment, went through a trial, and never, not once, broke. The question isn't where Frank Matthews went. The question is whether the woman he left behind was the one who told him exactly how to go. Before we go any further, I need you to understand, this is not the story you've heard before. This isn't another Where is Frank Matthews mystery. This is the story of the woman behind the disappearance, the woman the feds couldn't break, the woman who may have engineered the most successful vanishing in criminal history. Subscribe right now and drop your city in the comments, because this channel tells the stories that got buried, and Barbara Hinton's story has been buried for over half a century. Tell me where you're watching from, so that the underworld reports you will never miss. Let's go. Who Barbara Hinton actually was. Here's what the documentaries never show you. Every film about Frank Matthews, every podcast, every article treats Barbara Hinton as a footnote, the wife who got left behind, the woman holding grocery bags while the king disappeared with his girlfriend, a victim, a prop, background scenery in the story of a man. That's the first mistake everyone makes. Barbara Hinton wasn't scenery. She was infrastructure. She was living at 2785 Ocean Parkway in Brooklyn when Frank was using that apartment as a stash house, a place to hide paramours, hold meetings, and store cash before the Ears seized their Staten Island mansion at 7 Buttonwood Road in the Tot Hill neighborhood. That mansion sat 3 blocks from Paul Castellano, the boss of the Gambino crime family. Barbara didn't end up on that street by accident. She was the domestic architecture of an empire worth hundreds of millions. Think about what she saw every single day. Frank Matthews ran 2 drug mills in Brooklyn, one at 925 Prospect Place, nicknamed the Ponderosa, and another at 101 East 56th Street, nicknamed the OK Corral. Both were fortified with steel-reinforced walls and guarded by men carrying automatic weapons. His operation moved product through 21 states. Dealers visited from Philadelphia, Baltimore, Detroit, Atlanta, every major city on the eastern seaboard. Cash moved in and out of that household in volumes that most banks don't process. Barbara saw the money. She counted the money. She lived inside the money. When Frank hosted an unprecedented drug summit in Atlanta in 1971, gathering the biggest African-American and Hispanic traffickers in the country to discuss breaking free from the Italian mafia's heroin pipeline, Barbara knew. when he held a second summit at the Sands Hotel in Las Vegas during the Alley Quarry rematch in 1972, Barbara knew she wasn't some naive housewife who discovered her husband's secret life. She was the person who held the household together while an empire spanning 2 decades of American drug trafficking operated beneath its roof. And here's the detail that changes everything about how we read the disappearance. Before the feds indicted Frank in December 1972, investigators had evidence that he'd been quietly stashing $1 million a month into safety deposit boxes. $1 million a month. For months. Someone was helping him prepare. Someone who understood that the endgame wasn't prison. The endgame was disappearance. And the person with the most access to that household, to those finances, to those preparations, wasn't Cheryl Denise Brown, the girlfriend he eventually fled with. It was Barbara Hinton, the common-law wife who stayed behind and never said a word. The disappearance, what actually happened that night, June 26, 1973. A few days before his scheduled court appearance on July 2nd, Frank Matthews is out on $325,000 bail that federal prosecutors had called a bad joke because they'd originally demanded $5 million. The judge had reduced it, then reduced it again. Frank had to report regularly to the U.S. Attorney's Office and stay within the Eastern District of New York. That was it. No ankle monitor, no surveillance detail. The feds were short on manpower. Nobody was watching him. Assistant U.S. Attorney Raymond Deary had bumped into Matthews inside the Brooklyn Federal Courthouse days earlier. Frank had walked up to him, swaggering, smiling, flirting with the women in the hallway, greeting everyone he passed like he owned the building. Deary would later say, Frank looked and acted like the king of New York City. He walked around our turf like he owned it. Then Frank asked a question that stopped Deary cold. Mr. Deary, am I going to get that life count they've been talking about? He was asking about Section 848 of the Controlled Substances Act of 1970, the continuing criminal enterprise statute. If convicted under 848, he'd spend the rest of his life in prison. Not 20 years, not 30. Life, no parole. Deary looked at him. It's very possible, Frank. Very possible. Frank smiled, nodded, walked away. He never walked into that courthouse again. Somewhere between that conversation and July 2nd, Frank Matthews emptied his safety deposit boxes, gathered an estimated $15 to $20 million in cash, collected Cheryl Denise Brown, his 23-year-old girlfriend, and disappeared from the face of the earth. A friend reported they took a flight to Houston. After that, nothing. Alleged sightings in over 50 countries. Not one confirmed. No fingerprints. No Dina. No informant. No body. Nothing. But here's what everyone overlooks. The disappearance wasn't improvised. That $1 million a month going into safety deposit boxes for months before the indictment, that was planning. That was architecture. That was someone building an escape route brick by brick, while the feds thought they were building a case. And the person who managed that household's finances, who knew where the money was, who knew the routines, who knew the contacts, was sitting in a Brooklyn apartment on Ocean Parkway, feeding 3 boys breakfast when the federal agents came knocking. The interrogation, what Barbara told the feds. The FBI and Dee hit Barbara Hinton's apartment within hours of Frank's failure to appear. They expected panic. They expected tears. They expected a woman abandoned and desperate, ready to trade whatever she knew for immunity and protection. They got none of that. Barbara Hinton sat across from federal agents and delivered a response that became a legend in law enforcement. She told them she had never heard of a man named Frank Matthews. They showed her photographs. She didn't recognize him. They mentioned his aliases, Black Caesar, Pee-wee, Mark IV. She'd never heard those names. They described the mansion on Tot Hill where she had lived for years. She didn't recall it. They mentioned the 3 children she had with him, the 3 boys sleeping in the next room. She had nothing to say. The prosecutors escalated. They hauled her before a federal grand jury. This is where the government gets serious. Grand jury subpoenas carry the weight of the court. You testify, or you go to jail for contempt. They offered her full immunity, full protection, a clean slate. Cooperate. Tell us where Frank went. Tell us about his contacts, his escape route, his money, and you walk free. Your sons stay with you. Your life continues. Barbara Hinton refused. Not, I'll think about it. Not, let me talk to my lawyer first. Refused. Flat. Final. Absolute. Prosecutors warned her. Refuse to cooperate and you'll face conspiracy charges yourself. The same charges your husband is running from. You will be indicted. You will stand trial. You will be convicted, and your 3 boys will grow up without either parent. Barbara looked at them and said nothing. Stop and think about what this woman just did. 3 children, no visible income. The IRS has seized everything. The federal government is threatening to put her in prison. Every pressure point they have, they're pushing. And she chose silence. Not once. Not for a week. For over half a century. If you understand what that kind of discipline means, if you understand what that tells us about who Barbara Hinton really was, hit that like button right now. Because we're about to go deeper into this woman's story than anyone has ever gone. And what you find out is going to rewrite everything you thought about the Frank Matthews disappearance. They did exactly what they threatened. On January 29th, 1975, a year and a half after Frank vanished, federal prosecutors in Brooklyn filed a massive indictment. The charges covered a narcotics conspiracy spanning from September 1968 through January 1975. 18 members of what the New York Daily News called a black narcotics ring. The biggest federal drug case of its era. Barbara Hinton's name was on that indictment, not as a cooperating witness, not as an informant, as a defendant, charged with conspiracy. The message from the federal government was unmistakable. If you won't help us find your husband, we'll bury you instead. Her lawyer, Gino Galina, the same attorney who had represented Frank Matthews himself, argued in court that the prosecution was an act of retaliation. He told the judge that Barbara Hinton had not been indicted because she was guilty of drug trafficking. She had been indicted because she refused to tell the government where Frank Matthews was hiding. The jury didn't agree. On October 9th, 1975, 8 defendants were convicted, including Barbara Hinton, found guilty on the conspiracy charge, sentenced to 2 years imprisonment and a fine. She was 31 years old. Her case went through the appeals process. Her attorneys argued bad faith prosecution, that the government had used the indictment as leverage to force her cooperation. The appeal raised 7 points of error, including the claim that she'd been targeted by the same grand jury she had refused to cooperate with. The appeals court examined the case. Barbara's conspiracy conviction was ultimately upheld by the Second Circuit. 2 years. That's what they gave her. 2 years for refusing to talk. 2 years for choosing silence over betrayal. 2 years for protecting someone. Her husband? Her children? Herself? Or a plan that she had helped design from the very beginning? Because here's what the trial revealed without meaning to. Barbara Hinton was not a passive bystander. The court proceedings established that she had been embedded in the Matthews organization from 1968 forward. 7 years of active participation in a narcotics conspiracy that operated across the entire eastern seaboard. She wasn't a wife who didn't know. She was a wife who knew everything. And the federal government, with all its resources, all its grand jury power, all its threats and leverage and prison time, couldn't make her say a single word about any of it. After the trial, after the conviction, after prison, Barbara Hinton came home to Brooklyn and resumed a life that was designed, from every angle, to be invisible. She never cooperated. Not in 1973, not in 1975, not in the 1980s when a new generation of agents reopened the Matthews file, not in the 1990s when informants periodically surfaced with unverified stories, not in 2012 when documentary producers conducted roughly 20 interviews and came knocking at her door, not in 2025 when the FBI finally closed the case. 53 years of federal agents asking the same question, 53 years of the same answer, silence. She never remarried. Think about that. A woman in her early 30s when Frank disappeared, attractive, still young, decades of life ahead of her. She never took another husband, never publicly acknowledged another relationship. In the world of organized crime, that kind of behavior has a specific meaning. It means the first husband isn't gone. It means you're waiting. It means there's a reason to stay faithful to a ghost. She never publicly mourned Frank as a dead man. No funeral was ever held, no memorial, no closure ceremony, no public statement accepting his death. When law enforcement sources floated the theory that the Genovese crime family had lured Matthews to the Bahamas and killed him, a theory based on unconfirmed reports from former DEA agent Frank Panessa, Barbara's response was the same as it had always been. Nothing. She didn't confirm it. She didn't deny it. She existed in the space between alive and dead, and she stayed there for half a century. She raised those 3 boys alone, in the shadow of the most wanted fugitive in America, without the mansion, without the cars, without the lifestyle. Just a woman in a Brooklyn apartment with 3 sons who carried the last name of a ghost. The years had seized everything visible, but visible is the key word, because somewhere, at some point, money arrived. Reports circulated for decades that cash periodically reached the family through intermediaries, not through banks, not through wire transfers, through people who appeared, delivered, and vanished. The most famous incident, a package that arrived at the Brooklyn apartment not long after the disappearance. Inside, banded stacks of cash, no return address, no card, no signature. The kind of money that doesn't come from a savings account. The kind of money that comes from a man who left with $20 million. Barbara never reported it, never told authorities, never spent it in ways that would draw attention. She absorbed it into the quiet life she was building, the same way she absorbed everything else, silently, without explanation, without acknowledging where it came from or who sent it. Now let's look at the facts the way a detective would, not the way a journalist would, not the way a filmmaker would, the way someone who's trying to solve a 53-year-old mystery would. Fact 1. Frank Matthews was quietly stashing $1 million per month into safety deposit boxes for months before his indictment. That's not the behavior of a man who plans to fight his case. That's the behavior of a man building an exit. And that kind of financial engineering doesn't happen alone. Someone was helping him move, organize, and hide that money. Someone with intimate access to the household and the operation. Fact 2. Barbara Hinton was convicted of participating in a narcotics conspiracy from 1968 to 1975. The federal court established that she was embedded in the Matthews organization for 7 years. She wasn't ignorant of the business. She was part of it. If she was sophisticated enough to be part of a multi-state drug trafficking operation, she was sophisticated enough to help plan an escape. Fact 3. When federal agents arrived, Barbara didn't panic. She didn't cry. She didn't ask for help. She delivered a rehearsed response. I've never heard of a man named Frank Matthews, with the composure of someone who had anticipated this exact moment. That's not shock. That's preparation. Fact 4. She refused grand jury immunity. Think about what that means strategically. If Barbara genuinely didn't know where Frank was, accepting immunity and cooperating would have been the rational choice. It would have protected her from prosecution. It would have kept her with her children. The only reason to refuse immunity is if cooperating would reveal something more dangerous than the charges she was facing. If she talked, she wouldn't just be revealing Frank's location. She'd be revealing her role in getting him there. Fact 5. She never remarried. She never mourned him publicly. Money arrived through invisible channels. These are not the behaviors of an abandoned woman. These are the behaviors of a woman who is part of a plan, a long-term, multi-generational plan that required silence, discipline, and a level of operational security that most professional criminals can't maintain for a year, let alone half a century. Fact 6. Frank Matthews' entire criminal career was built on compartmentalization. He ran a 21-state drug network without a single wiretap, catching him for 7 years. He used layers of intermediaries, each person knowing only the link before them and the link after. Classic intelligence tradecraft. If he applied that same methodology to his escape, the person who held the most critical information, the origin point, the blueprint, the architect, would be someone the government would never suspect of being the planner, someone they would dismiss as a victim, someone they'd waste decades pitying instead of investigating, someone like a common law wife left behind with 3 children and an empty apartment and a story about never having heard his name. Barbara Hinton's 3 sons were young children when their father walked out of their lives. The oldest was barely old enough to form lasting memories. The youngest may not have remembered him at all. They grew up in what must have been the strangest possible childhood. Other kids had fathers who went to work in the morning and came home at night. The Matthews boys had a father whose face was on a wanted poster, a father whose name made federal agents sit up straight in their chairs, a father who was famous the way ghosts are famous. Everyone had heard of him. Nobody had seen him. Barbara had to make a choice that no mother should ever face. She couldn't say their father was in prison, because he wasn't. She couldn't say he was dead, because she apparently didn't believe that. She couldn't say he had abandoned them, because the money suggested otherwise. So she chose the only option left. She said nothing. She protected them with silence. The same weapon she'd used against the federal government, she now used to shield her children from a truth too complicated for any child to carry. The boys grew up with fragments, a photograph overheard from an uncle, a name whispered in a barber shop, a stranger who appeared at the apartment, delivered something, and left without explanation. They knew their father was powerful. They knew he was gone. They knew their mother carried a secret so heavy that the entire United States government had tried to pry it from her and failed. As they got older, the questions multiplied. Other kids had fathers at basketball games, at graduations, at weddings. The Matthews boys had a legend and a silence. They had a face aging in a federal database somewhere, while their real father, if he was alive, was aging somewhere else entirely, in a country they'd never visited, living a life they'd never know. The cruelest part wasn't the absence. It was the ambiguity. If Frank Matthews had died, they could have mourned. If he'd gone to prison, they could have visited. But he'd done something worse than either. He'd vanished into a question mark, and that question mark hung over every holiday, every birthday, every moment where a father should have been standing but wasn't. And through all of it, through every empty chair, every unanswered question, every federal agent who came knocking, Barbara Hinton maintained the same position she'd maintained since 1973. Silence, unbreakable, total, complete. She turned that silence into a fortress and raised 3 boys inside it. In December 2025, after 52 years, federal authorities officially ended their search for Frank Matthews. The FBI closed the case. The DIA moved on. The $20,000 reward, once the highest in federal history, matching the bounty that had been placed on John Dillinger, was retired. The announcement barely made the news, a paragraph in a few outlets, a mention on a true crime podcast. After half a century, the world had stopped caring about Black Caesar. New kingpins, new fugitives, new mysteries had taken his place in the public imagination. But for Barbara Hinton, that announcement meant something different. It meant the surveillance was over. The phone taps, if any still existed, could be disconnected. The agents who periodically checked in, who knocked on doors, who followed threads that led nowhere, they were done. For the first time in 53 years, Barbara Hinton could exist without the federal government looking over her shoulder. If Frank Matthews is still alive, he would be 82 years old. He disappeared at 29. He's been gone longer than most people's entire adult lives. His sons are now men in their 50s, older than their father was when he vanished. They have their own children, maybe grandchildren. An entire generation that has never met the man whose blood runs through their veins. And Barbara, if she's still alive, would be in her 80s. A woman who has kept a secret for longer than most marriages last, longer than most careers last, longer than most people stay in the same house, the same city, the same life. Every theory about Frank Matthews leads back to her. If he's alive in a country with no extradition treaty, Barbara knows which country. If he's dead, Barbara knows who killed him. If money moved through invisible channels for decades, Barbara knows who carried it. If messages reached the family through third parties and fourth parties and fifth parties, each link knowing only the person before and the person after, Barbara knows the first link in the chain. She knows the origin. She's always known. The FBI closed the case. But the case was never really about finding Frank Matthews. It was about breaking Barbara Hinton. And in 53 years, across 2 generations of federal agents, through a grand jury, a trial, a conviction, prison time, and decades of pressure, they never came close. This story has no ending. That's the point. That's what makes it different from every other crime story ever told. Frank Lucas got caught. Nicky Barnes got caught. El Chapo got caught. Even the ones who died had endings. Their families knew. The world knew. Frank Matthews has no ending. Just a woman who never talked. And 3 boys who became men without ever hearing their father explain why he left. If this story changed the way you think about the Matthews disappearance, if you now understand that the real mystery was never the man who vanished, but the woman who stayed, share this. Subscribe if you haven't. Because next week, the story I'm bringing you is going to break open another case that's been sealed shut for decades. You don't want to miss it. There is a photograph that circulates in crime history circles. Frank Matthews standing in Staten Island, 1971. To his left, Barbara Hinton. To his right, his mother. 3 people, 1 empire, 1 future that none of them could see coming. Look at Barbara in that photograph. She's not looking at the camera. She's not posing. She's looking at Frank, studying him, the way someone studies a problem they've already solved. Everyone who ever investigated Frank Matthews made the same assumption. They assumed the disappearance was his plan, his genius, his move. They assumed Barbara was the woman left holding the bag, abandoned, humiliated, replaced by a younger girlfriend while the king escaped to paradise. But what if they had it backwards? What if Barbara Hinton wasn't the woman who got left behind? What if she was the woman who sent him away? What if the $1 million a month going into safety deposit boxes was her accounting? What if the escape route was her architecture? What if the girlfriend, Cheryl Denise Brown, wasn't a betrayal, but a decoy? A beautiful distraction that would make every investigator in America focus on the romantic angle, while the real operator sat quietly in Brooklyn, feeding 3 boys breakfast, waiting for the knock on the door she'd been, preparing for all along? What if the most successful disappearance in the history of American organized crime wasn't engineered by the most wanted man in America, but by his common-law wife, a woman the federal government spent 53 years underestimating? Nobody knows. Barbara Hinton made sure of that. She turned silence into a weapon so powerful that the FBI, the DEA, the EARS, the U.S. Marshals, and 53 years of investigation couldn't penetrate it. She took the indictment. She took the conviction. She took the prison time. She took the loneliness of raising 3 boys without their father. She took every single consequence, and she never gave them a single word in return. In the history of organized crime, men get the statues, men get the movies, men get the documentaries and the podcasts and the legend. But in the Frank Matthews case, the person who displayed the most discipline, the most strategic thinking, the most unbreakable resolve, wasn't the man who ran. It was the woman who stayed. And she won.